more precisely the case of Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong. It's a pleasure to have you here at the Domaine de Pont, but it's also a pleasure to welcome all those who follow us on Zoom. There are many other of you following on Zoom, or those who follow this video stream on our website, www.pressclub.ch, or on our Facebook or YouTube page. So we are touching today a very important subject, and we are very happy and proud to have with us so distinguished speakers. I just want to make special thanks to Maria Ressa. She is getting used to come to Geneva because Maria Ressa was already here for the Press Freedom Day in May in Geneva, along with Dmitry Muratov from Novaya Gazeta. So the two Nobel Prizes at the same time in Geneva. It was a pleasure and a pleasure to have you here again. And we also have online, very important for sure, the son of Jimmy Lai, Sebastien Lai, that we want to give a special welcome. But we know that today press freedom is much under pressure. All the stories like this of Jimmy Lai, like this of Assange, like many others, this of Dmitry Muratov, who just lost his license in Russia. The pressure is growing and growing, and resistance must be growing too at the same time. And so it's important that we have the kind of meetings, press conference that we have here, and you are all very welcome. And without going on further, I give right away the word to John Simpson. John Simpson is an editor from the BBC. Welcome to you. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pierre. And thank you very much, everybody, for being here and for watching online and for taking an interest in this. Jimmy Lai.
Closer to the microphone, please. You have to speak close to the microphone. It's okay, it works, but it's just...
Oh, I see, like a rock star. Oh, yes. Yeah. That seems to work, doesn't it? Yes, not the rock star part. Jimmy Lai is, I like to say, a personal friend of mine. I mean, I'm not quite sure whether the relationship is strong enough to talk about him as a personal friend, but given the circumstances that he's in, I think it's quite important to stand up and be counted for him. As you know, he is an important, was at any rate, an important media figure in Hong Kong, with his own both Cantonese language and English language newspapers and outlets, which, of course, were fairly critical quite often of the way that Hong Kong was going. He's now 74. He doesn't need to be in prison. He's a wealthy man in his own right. He has a British passport. He could have avoided all of this, and he could be watching from Geneva or London and making statements. But Jimmy wanted to stand up and be counted for the right to speak out in Hong Kong and to support those friends of his and as well as some of his employees who are also having real difficulties with the government, many of them in jail. And now Jimmy faces the possibility at least of life imprisonment, and for a 74-year-old man, that is a serious consideration. We're very fortunate to have his son Sebastien on the screen, speaking to us from Taiwan, and I've another hero of modern journalism, Maria Ressa. She nodded. She didn't know what I was going to say. Nobel Prize winner for her brilliant coverage, which, you know, those of her colleagues like me can only stand awestruck at the courage that you've shown, Maria. And I know that Jimmy's case is only one of several that you're really interested in, is important to you, and I just want to remind people what the Nobel Prize Peace Prize Committee said. You were a fearless defender of the freedom of expression, and that is precisely what Jimmy Lai is in jail for. Caoilfhionn Gallagher QC on my right is a doughty fighter, because that's a rather feeble pun. She works for the Doughty Street Chambers, but a doughty fighter for the rights of expression, and has represented all sorts of people, including, in fact, the BBC Persian service, which is very badly treated by the government in Iran, and the relatives and families of people who work for the BBC Persian service have a very hard time of it, and Caoilfhionn represents them. And on my left is Jodie Ginsberg, who's the president of the Committee to Protect Journalists, based now in New York. But you were the Reuters boss in London, I think, at one stage, weren't you? And so, I mean, she knows journalism from the inside, and now it's her job to fight the cause of journalists who are in serious trouble, just as Jimmy Lai is. So, if we can start off with Sebastien. Oh, and I think I was supposed to say something about come to the drinks reception afterwards, which is always not the nicest thing one can say. There will be one, so you can, really kind of cheer up after the session. So please do that. And there are, as you can see, cameras here. And the whole thing will be recorded because we want as big an audience as possible. Next week, I should say, is the meeting of the UN Human Rights Council, and the latest meeting, the 51st session, I think it is. And obviously, it would be an important thing for a strong statement to go out from the UNHRC about Jimmy's case. But let's first of all go across to Taiwan. And Sebastien, just kind of tell us a bit who your father is, the kind of person he is, Sebastien.
So I would just like to say that it's obviously under not very great circumstances, but it's a real honor for me to be able to share this with all of you. And first of all, thank you very much for being here. It really means a lot. So Dad, as you so eloquently put it, Dad founded Apple Daily and Next Magazine, which were one of the biggest newspapers in both Taiwan and Hong Kong. And it was also one of the biggest pro-democracy medias, Chinese in the Chinese language. It was the biggest pro-democracy media in Chinese language. So Dad is a very polarizing figure, actually. He there's people who hate him, who very much dislike him, because he's someone that makes you choose. He's someone that has a very clear. He has a very clear picture of what he believes to be right and wrong, and these moralistic decisions don't come very often in life, but when they do come, Dad sticks to his convictions and backs it with everything that he has. And I think that is what describes Dad the best in the current and currently what's happening.
What do you think motivates him? Why does he do it? He's putting his life on the line now, isn't he?
Yeah. I think it comes from a love of Hong Kong and the freedom that it's given him. He always attributes the Hong Kong for basically everything that he has, right? It's going from a child manual laborer to becoming a media tycoon, and it's just one of these situations where he feels like he has to fight for that freedom. He has to, give his all for that freedom. It almost feels like a duty. I mean, it's by no means the rational thing to do, but if he truly believes that it is the right thing to do.
How did your father react to the worsening of the situation in Hong Kong?
So when the National Security Law came down, a lot of people convinced him to, try to convince him to leave, but that just said he was staying. That it was as simple as that. He just told everyone that, try to convince him that he wasn't going to leave, because he sees himself as this troublemaker, right? He's not afraid to express his opinions, and he runs a sort of a fearless newspaper, and so he decided to stay. He decided to stay and stand with the rest of the people of Hong Kong.
What do you hear? Do you hear from him? I mean, is he able to contact you? What about the conditions that he's in jail under?
So I could write letters to him, and so we do have periodic contact. He reads a lot. I mean, he's read a lot his whole life, and he's actually recently gotten into painting. So a lot of religious painting. I think his faith helps him a lot as well while he's in jail.
What are the latest developments in his case, as far as you know? I mean, where are we? They're charging him with all sorts of fairly fierce things, like foreign collusion, which can have a very serious. I mean, it can have a life sentence.
Sedition as well. Yeah, it's. So he's currently on remand. So he's been denied bail, so he's still in prison, and he's awaiting a verdict on October 25th, and then his NSL trial is in December, and the National Security Law trial, along with the rest of his colleagues, is the one where there's going to be no jury. It carries a maximum sentence of life imprisonment, and it's judges chosen by the government.
And who's defending him in court?
So we have a very capable Hong Kong legal team that is there to defend him, and it's we hope it works. Yeah.
What message do the cases against your father and some of his staff and other journalists in Hong Kong, what message does all this send to the world in general about the situation in Hong Kong?
Well, to quote a horrible man, there is freedom of speech, but I can't guarantee freedom after speech. It's the Hong Kong government has told everyone that they will uphold these freedoms, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. But what they haven't told you is that there's a new price for it, and the cost has drastically gone up. And it's it's true for obviously journalists who started cracking down on even a few years ago, but also for your average citizen who for the citizen who enjoys these freedoms. That's a new price of free speech in Hong Kong.
Finally, Sebastien, I know that you're close to your father. What does it do to a family the head of it to be taken away and jailed, perhaps for life. How do you react to that?
Well, it's what Dad's doing. On one side, it's incredibly inspirational for us, and we know that he's making the right decision, and we stand by him through this period. But obviously, it's I can't tell you how much I miss him. It's yeah.
Can I ask you a really hard question? Do you think you'll see him again?
Yeah, I think one of the hallmarks of well, at least Dad and that he's passed on to me is optimism. So yeah, I believe that I'll see him again. I don't know under what circumstances, I don't know when, but I truly believe I'll see him again.
Okay, well, thank you so much for talking to us. It's a great pleasure to see you, and we'll obviously watch very closely to see how it all goes. Maria Ressa, you won the Nobel Peace Prize for journalism. I mean, that lifts the status of the profession hugely, and so we all are grateful to you for that. I noticed that Sebastien said, lovely phrase, he said his father considers himself to be a troublemaker. Do you consider yourself to be a troublemaker?
No, I mean troublemaker. Oh, okay. Troublemaker. No, I'm like the geeky kid in class. That's why it's ironic that Jimmy is far more of a troublemaker than I am, but we're in the same place. Well, he's worse than where I am. Look, well, first of all, Sebastien, thank you for having me here. I mean, it's I really would just like to bring 3 points, and they are the same things that we've been saying, and it shows you how Jimmy Lai is also at the forefront of this battle for free expression, the battle for journalists, to continue doing our jobs. The first is really the only defense of a journalist under attack is to shine the light, which is what I hope we're doing now, right? I don't think we've done this enough in Jimmy's case, but the first is shine the light. You've heard me say this a lot. The second, that silence is complicity. And then the third is hold the line. Again, 3 things. So the first one is please know who Jimmy is. You heard a little bit from Sebastien, but it's from a son. But if you look at Jimmy Lai, at 12 years old, he fled mainland China as a stowaway on a fishing boat to Hong Kong. And he lost his first huge mega company, a company we in Asia know very well, Giordano, because he stood up for the principles, and he helped make sure that the shareholders of Giordano weren't disadvantaged by his standing up for the values, right? So that was in his 20s. There are very few media owners when they're faced with such force who will hold the line, because the media owner is also responsible for the money that comes in. And he did, and it moved very fast. I think the biggest problem that we're facing in terms of Hong Kong is you have essentially an extrajudicial law that is being executed by a very efficient Hong Kong bureaucracy. And first in line are the journalists. In the Philippines, the joke is we took that old phrase, first they came for the journalists, we don't know what happened next. On the second thing, silence is complicity. I've had to be in this strange position, and partly because I think we are right back to where it was right after World War II, when we are destroying ourselves. In the Nobel lecture, I talked about an atom bomb exploding in our information ecosystem. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Chautauqua on the same stage where Salman Rushdie was attacked. Look at what a man has given up for free expression. And it was more than 30 years since a fatwa, and the community was shattered. And yet, It was the community. It was people who were sitting on the front row who came up to help Salman Rushdie as soon as it was clear what was happening. Dmitry Muratov, who is my co-Nobel winner in 2021, just yesterday, he voluntarily, I think when we were here last May, the government in Russia, Putin had already said that it would be illegal to use the word war to describe what's happening in Ukraine. And so they decided to stop publishing. But just yesterday, Novaya Gazeta lost its license to operate. I just tweeted the way Dmitry talked about what's happening. Truth will win over hell. He can't say war, so he decided to call war hell. Truth will win over hell. And then I think this third one, which I touch because we share the same lawyer, so I touch, with Jimmy Lai. I met Jimmy Lai because I was trying to hire away a high performer from Apple Daily. And he was quite forbidding when we met. But, when I was when I came home to the Philippines and I was heading the largest news organization, I would look at Next Media, it was called Next Media then, and look at their 3D graphics. The woman I had tried to hire away from Jimmy's company in Hong Kong, they were making, you may not get a sense in the West of how huge Apple Daily was, but they were at 8 million uniques per day, right? What you saw in the Wall Street Journal is 9.6 million uniques in Hong Kong. But when you pull it all the way out, it is it's huge. And to all of a sudden have this shut down, I think is something that is a little astounding, and to have 200 officers walk into their office and arrest him. Think about this happening here in Geneva. Could it? If you don't think it can, it's coming. What's happening to us is coming for you. We are all in the same world. Finally, the last one, which is hold the line. I say this all the time. If we look away, we voluntarily step back. And for us in Asia, in Southeast Asia in particular, it's not so easy to step up against dictators to be, because the costs are very real. But you don't want to voluntarily give up your rights. Jimmy Lai is holding the line. I think the least we can do is help him.
Can I ask you a question? Do you think that what the authorities in Hong Kong are doing to Jimmy will frighten journalists in other places, perhaps those who have to deal with the Chinese, and indeed wider, like in the Philippines?
Yeah, absolutely. When this happened, I was in the Philippines trying to figure out, the same time that this security law was imposed in Hong Kong, we had our anti-terrorism law, right? And so, in a way, it's almost like the dictator's playbook. And China is huge. I shouldn't even say that. There were, in 2020, in September of 2020, Facebook took down information operations from China that were attacking me. I'm very small, and I'm only one journalist, but Jimmy's far taller, and he is a media mogul. Think about it like that, right? So the reason I was targeted in the Philippines was because if they can do that to Maria, to me, I had already headed news organizations, I had worked overseas, I had led 2 bureaus for CNN. If they could do that to me, then they could do it to anyone else. And does it have a chilling effect? Oh my gosh, it's Siberia. So it's important that when you do get targeted, you hold the line.
Right. I think, often on things like this, when you talk about these kind of issues, the Chinese government tends to say you're targeting us, you're being anti-Chinese. But in fact, everything you said is about the freedom of journalists everywhere, isn't it? It's not specifically anti-China.
China, no offense to you, but give people the right to speak. Why is speech so dangerous? you know, and actually in a world like today, I guess this is the last part, right? In our world today where we are facing existential problems, the government that does the best is the one that harnesses its people. But can I add one last thing, and this is for people in every democracy around the world. If you look at where the patterns are leading us, we are seeing this year elections, for example, in more than 30 countries around the world. The Philippines had our presidential elections May 9th, right? We overwhelmingly elected the son and namesake of Ferdinand Marcos 36 years after we ousted the family in a people power revolt. You have Kenya just had elections. Brazil will have elections. Then next year, you've got Turkey, you've got Africa. 2024, you have Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim population. India, the world's largest democracy, and the United States. Oh, did I mention the UK just happened in a non-election election? Let me get to the point of that. We've looked through all these different places in our information ecosystem, social media, the tech platforms, amplify lies over hate. If nothing is done now, 2024 becomes the year where democracy dies. There are enough illiberal leaders will have been elected that geopolitical power will shift. I hope I'm wrong, John.
I hope you are. I've got a nasty feeling you're not usually wrong. Thank you. Caoilfhionn Gallagher, I mean, you're effectively the legal representative of Jimmy Lai, aren't you? I mean, you're not actually there and you're not able to speak in court. Tell me a little bit about the case against him. Well, there are many cases against him. How strong are they? What's the likely outcome?
Thank you. So I should say first, I lead the international legal team for Jimmy Lai, working with Jonathan Price and Jennifer Robinson, who are in the room. I hope for those of you in the room, we can speak to you afterwards if you've got any specific questions. There is quite separately a domestic legal team working in the domestic proceedings. And one of the serious concerns about what's happening currently in Hong Kong is that, I'll come to this in a moment, simply by virtue of working with international lawyers, both Jimmy Lai and indeed us as international lawyers are now also being targeted by the authorities. And it's suggested that it's potentially an act of sedition to even engage with international human rights lawyers and to even engage with criticizing the authorities before UN mechanisms and international bodies, which is a deeply concerning trend in this case. I just wanted to start by saying huge thanks to all of you who've made the time in what I know is a very busy period in the lead up to the Human Rights Council, coming to us in the room or joining us online. And many of us have seen the hashtag journalism is not a crime. And yet here we sit, Maria Ressa, one of my very brave clients to my left, treated as a criminal in the Philippines simply for doing her job, simply for being a journalist, for speaking truth to power. And we're discussing this other deeply troubling case, Jimmy Lai, criminalized again for speaking truth to power. And what Maria and Jimmy have in common, amongst many other things, is that, as you indicated at the start, John, they are not journalists in exile. They're journalists who've decided to stay put and do their job and hold power to a case in Hong Kong in Jimmy Lai's case. And for that, Maria faces decades in prison. Jimmy Lai faces potentially the rest of his life in prison, having been in prison already for 2 years. And that's why these cases are so hugely important. I wanted to just start by giving a little bit of background. We've spoken, there's been reference by Sebastien and by others to the national security law, which I know many of you joining us online and in the room will be familiar with, the deeply pernicious national security law from 2 years ago. But it's important to also indicate that what's happened to Mr. Lai had a long hinterland. So Mr. Lai, due to his work, his principles, his opinions, his work as a media entrepreneur and a pro-democracy campaigner and a long-standing advocate of peaceful assembly, has been targeted for many years prior to the national security law. The national security law and other steps in the past 2 years have enabled that targeting to be escalated and for him to now be behind bars. But it's against a long backdrop. We knew this was coming, and the world didn't do enough then. And the key message we have for you today is we must do more now. And it won't surprise you to know at the end of my remarks I've got some asks for those of you in the room and online. Jimmy Lai was questioned over a long period of time about his support for a free press. He was questioned over a long period of time over his advocacy of peaceful demonstration and peaceful protest. He was targeted over a decade prior to the national security law in a range of ways. He was placed under intimidatory constant surveillance, which has been well documented since 2013. Both his home and the headquarters of his business enterprise Next Daily were petrol bombed in 2015. His attackers seemingly able to act with total impunity, with the authorities unable or unwilling to take steps to protect him, to protect his rights to live and pursue his media and campaigning work free from violence or the threat of violence. So these aren't new issues. We knew they were coming. But it did intensify with the passing of the controversial national security law, which Sebastien referred to earlier. And of course, in August 2020, he was arrested and he remains in prison now. And in June 2021, Apple Daily ceased operating, forced to close after 26 years of operation, after authorities arrested 5 of its senior executives, froze the company's assets, as well as Jimmy Lai's own assets, leaving the newspaper with no choice but to close. And Maria's mentioned what a megalith Apple Daily was, and just how deeply concerning it is that it could be shuttered in that way. And it's important to say that Apple Daily, when founded in 1995, as the handover of Hong Kong to the Chinese government approached, was founded expressly and explicitly on the basis of pro-democracy and anti-corruption as guiding principles. And it was highly critical of power and of Hong Kong's increasingly pro-Beijing ruling class over a period of time. And for that, Mr. Lai now sits behind bars, languishing in a Hong Kong prison. Now, the closure of the newspaper in June 2021 was described by Amnesty International as the blackest day for Hong Kong's democracy, a phrase with which we agree. It sent a clear message that the national security law imposed by Beijing on Hong Kong was being used to stifle freedom of expression, freedom of the press. And it plainly undermined, in a very serious way, media freedom and pluralism at a critical time. And of course, as we know, media freedom and pluralism are essential for a functioning democracy. Jimmy Lai's imprisonment has also been the subject of critical commentary by the international community. By way of example, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, voiced concern that Mr. Lai faced negative consequences for the exercise of his fundamental rights, and she has raised concern that the national security law is leading journalists to increasingly self-censor to avoid clashing with its vaguely formulated offences. And in July 2021, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken released a statement marking a year of the national security law, referring to the Hong Kong authorities mounting a persistent and politically motivated campaign against the free press and criticising expressly their jailing of Jimmy Lai. We're also conscious that almost a year ago, a number of UN special rapporteurs condemned the misuse of the national security law in Hong Kong and the use of charges of terrorism and sedition to stifle local opposition voices, freedom of speech, assembly and political participation in Hong Kong. We agree with all of those criticisms. I want to highlight for you an additional deeply concerning trend that we've seen in the past 18 months, which should alarm all of you in the room or in the virtual room today. We have seen Hong Kong and Chinese authorities no longer being content with attempting to silence journalists and critics within their own borders, but also taking steps to silence criticism and civil society wherever in the world it may come from. Now, that's not a surprise to us in circumstances where the national security law was described from the outset by Amnesty International as dangerously vague and broad. Virtually anything could be deemed a threat to national security under its provisions, and it can apply to anyone on the planet. It's got extraterritorial effect. Now, that's the context in which we've seen, for example, Hong Kong Watch, an NGO based in London, threatened for content posted on its London-based website by authorities from Hong Kong. That's the context in which we, as Mr. Lai's international legal team, have received a wide range of shadowy threats, warnings, and cyber attacks, with a clear message that if we set foot within Hong Kong, we ourselves will be arrested. Or indeed, if we travel to a country with an extradition treaty with Hong Kong, we ourselves are at risk. The message is clear. Keep silent. You'll be next. You'll be targeted too. In addition, Jimmy Lai's case is a clear example of lawfare, to use a phrase very familiar to Maria, as a target herself. And lawfare involves using law as a weapon to silence anyone perceived to be a threat. And increasingly, one of the trends that I see as an international lawyer is not only traditional legal tools being used against journalists, which in a way are easier to understand, so libel laws or counter-terrorism laws, but also journalists being accused of, for example, fraud, tax evasion, and so on. And it's much harder to tell the story about why those types of legal attacks on journalists are wrong and flawed, because mud sticks. But actually, as we see in Maria's case or in Jimmy Lai's case, that range of attacks is hugely problematic, and that's a new weapon that we're seeing used. It's like a form of jurisprudential whack-a-mole, so you've got to deal with attacks on multiple fronts and in multiple ways. Now, we know about the national security law being used against Jimmy Lai, and his trial is coming up starting on the 1st of December 2021, unless that date moves. But the range of other mechanisms used against him under the law include, for example, regulatory tax and fraud laws being used against him, and in October we'll see the verdict in a bogus sham fraud trial. But he's also been charged, of course, and convicted in a range of peaceful protest cases. Just to give you a flavour, so he was convicted in 4 separate sets of criminal proceedings resulting from entirely peaceful participation in high-profile pro-democracy protests between 2019 and 20. I'll give you 2 of the examples. One was a protest on the 18th of August 2019 when an estimated 1.7 million people, that's approximately a quarter of the population, attended Victoria Park calling for freedom and democracy in Hong Kong. And it included a public procession through the town. And for participation in that peaceful protest, Mr. Lai received concurrent sentences of 12 months and 9 months. It also includes a case concerning a vigil held on the 4th of June 2020, as it's held every year to mark the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square protests. 20,000 people attended that protest. Jimmy Lai was present for 15 minutes to light a candle to show his support to the victims. 15 minutes lighting a candle to show respect to the victims at an entirely peaceful protest. Sentence, 13 months imprisonment. So that's what we're dealing with as the background. And it's important we don't just think of the national security law, we look at the range of other laws used against him. Key question for those of us in the room and virtual room today is what can now be done about what we've heard described, these egregious attacks on freedom of expression, democratic values, and the rule of law, including the misuse of a range of laws in Hong Kong, and extraterritorial attacks outside the Hong Kong and China. We're obviously having this discussion within days of the Human Rights Council starting, and at a point which is key for Mr. Lai's own case. And our overriding message to you today is that there is much for the international community to do, and we ask you to do it. Quiet grumbles behind the scenes did not protect Mr. Lai from the escalation in legal harassment which resulted with him being put behind bars in 2020 and resulted in Apple Daily being shuttered in 2021. Quiet backroom diplomacy has not worked in this case to date over the last 2 years. There's nothing to indicate it will succeed in the weeks and months ahead. So we ask you today to take concrete action. I've got a few specific requests. We as the international legal team have filed 2 complaints with the Human Rights Council's special procedures mechanisms, with the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention and with a number of UN special rapporteurs, including the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders on protest and assembly and freedom of expression. And we ask those mandates to both raise concerns urgently with the Hong Kong and Chinese authorities and to make public statements holding the authorities to account. And we ask all of you in the room to press those mandates to support our appeals and take that action. I see many of you in the room today are from states, from diplomatic missions here in Geneva. We ask you to raise Jimmy Lai's case and the broader concerns that it raises with your capitals and in your bilateral relations with Hong Kong and China. Ensure that these key principles are pressed in those meetings at this key time. Press for all charges to be dropped against Mr. Lai, for him to be released from prison immediately. More generally, press for the pernicious national security law to be revoked. And if your country is one of the many that has an extradition treaty with China and Hong Kong, take steps to now change that, as so many states have done in recent months, and as is supported by the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. A particular plea to the UK. We emphasise that Jimmy Lai is a UK national. He is a UK national, imprisoned in Hong Kong for his principles, in circumstances which have attracted widespread condemnation. His prosecution and imprisonment flagrantly violates international law and international standards. Today, there's a new Prime Minister in the UK, Liz Truss, the former Foreign Secretary, and a new Foreign Secretary will imminently take her place in that role. And we ask that the UK speaks out in support of its citizen. We also ask all states in the room and those watching online or catching up later to raise this case and concerns regarding arbitrary detention of others in Hong Kong during the interactive dialogue with the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention on the 19th of September. We also ask you to make public statements making clear your support and solidarity for Mr. Lai. For those of you who are journalists and writers, tell the story. Shout from the rooftops about what is happening in Hong Kong, what has happened to Apple Daily, what is happening to Jimmy Lai. He, at this stage, faces this barrage of spurious cases, the risk of spending his life behind bars, all due to standing up for his principles. It is essential that we now stand up and we are counted, to use the words John Simpson used at the start of this event. He did that, speaking out and holding truth to power in Hong Kong. And this is the price he's paid, and these are the risks he faces. We must also stand up and be counted. That's essential for Jimmy Lai. It's essential for Hong Kong, but it also sends a key message. If journalism truly is not a crime, we must ensure that Hong Kong and the Chinese authorities do not continue to criminalize this wonderful man. And of course, he, in many ways, is one of the most important people in the room today, but he's not here. But I think from his son, Sebastien, you've got a flavour of the courage and the underlying steely determination and commitment to principle, which is a familial trait. And I hope all of you in the room will do everything you possibly can to hold the authorities to account and to change the current trajectory, which is not looking good for Mr. Lai. We're very grateful for your support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caoilfhionn. Thank you indeed. Jodie, you're the president of the committee to protect journalists. You see it from a slightly different position from Caoilfhionn's. Can I ask you, first of all, do you think that the British and American governments have done enough? Yes, no, you can have this one. Okay.
So the simple answer to this is no, and you heard it from Caoilfhionn. You know, we hear a lot about quiet diplomacy, backroom diplomacy. We've had some positive movement from the US government. We've had the statements from Secretary Blinken, but frankly, the response of the British government, and I remind you that Jimmy Lai as a British national has been woeful. We've had very little publicly from the last two foreign secretaries, and it's time now, with a new Prime Minister and soon to be a new Foreign Secretary, that the stance changes. We need to see public statements. We need to see clear and concrete action from the British government. The British made a big show in 2019 of leading a media freedom campaign. The then Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt initiated a media freedom initiative. We had a big showy conference in London. A media freedom coalition was established, and yet faced with the imprisonment of an editor, a publisher such as Jimmy Lai, the British government has done precious little, to be frank. And I think the key thing in all of this, as we've heard from Maria, is this isn't just about the case of Jimmy Lai. This is about what's happening to journalists globally, and particularly in Hong Kong. And it's vital that we fight for Jimmy, not just for him as an individual, but because of what he represents and what he stands for. And that is, he represents what is happening to journalists in very many places around the world. And I'll give you an example of Hong Kong. Hong Kong had 0 journalists in prison under CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists Prison Census, that we've been running for many years until last year. In 2021, it had 8. It's gone from 0 to 8 in a year. And that's because of the direction of travel that we've seen over many years that culminated in this national security legislation, but has been an insidious creep over a number of years that's seen increased Chinese control of the media and increased pressure on journalists. And I think what I really want to stress here is we often focus on the arrests and unfortunately sometimes in other places in the world of the killings of journalists. But that's really when things have got to their worst point. What happens in the run-up to that is a whole series of restrictions on journalists that prevent them from doing their job and prevent them from delivering the news, and therefore individuals become increasingly reliant on the very few who are brave enough and courageous enough to stand up. So what we've seen in Hong Kong is the takeover, for example, of the radio television. Hong Kong has been increasingly a government, a Beijing mouthpiece. We've seen online harassment of journalists, independent journalists, as Maria knows very well. That barrage of online harassment, threats against you, is often enough to prevent journalists from straying into political territory. Then we've seen physical threats. It used to be the case that journalists were able to report relatively safely on protests. You think about 2003 when this legislation was first mooted and we had huge protests and then the bill was dropped. Apple Daily was able to run quite a public campaign saying, "See you in the streets." That's all changed now. Journalists are frequently targeted with rubber bullets, water cannon in protests. It's not safe to report as a journalist on the streets. And so all of this, not just the jailing, which is an excellent deterrent for everyone else, because as Maria said, if they can come for her, if they can come for Jimmy, then they can sure as hell come for you. But it's not just that. That's a sort of endpoint deterrent. It's all the other more minor, more creeping, more insidious methods that are used to prevent journalists from reporting the news, including foreign correspondents, right? So we've had not just Hong Kong-based journalists, Hong Kong nationals unable to report the news, but we've seen journalists, say, from The Economist denied their visa, or from the FT ejected from Hong Kong. All of that means you have fewer and fewer people who are able to report objectively and independently on what's going on in Hong Kong, and that's what we need journalists for. So it's vital that the likes of the United Kingdom are more active in the cases of such as that of Jimmy Lai, not just, as I say, for Jimmy Lai, but because of what he stands for in Hong Kong, but also globally, because it will come to us. These things are not happening far away in the world's most autocratic regimes. Increasingly, these methods are being used in supposed democracies, and it's time that supposed democracies started pushing back.
Are there journalists still working in Hong Kong that keep the standard, that don't back away from the difficult issues, or is it just really becoming impossible?
There are independent journalists, they're much smaller outlets often. It's much harder, and many of them choose not necessarily to tackle some of the most politically sensitive issues, such as elections, but they still continue to report on public interest issues of health, some excellent journalism around COVID and the way in which authorities handled COVID, for example, but increasingly that's becoming harder and harder. Some are doing that from outside of the country, but as many of my colleagues know, it's much harder to report effectively on a country from outside it. So there are pockets of that, often individuals as opposed to outlets. It is happening, but even that is more self-censorious than in previous years.
Now, I think we ought to try to bring in some questions. It just occurred to me, there's a gentleman there.
Please tell your name and organization.
Martin De Sapinto, ex-colleague of Ms. Ginsberg over there, now independent investigator. How problematic is it, do you think, that the national broadcaster of a supposedly advanced nation is dominated by donors and members of the ruling party? And I think you know where I'm going with that.
Does anybody want to answer that?
I can. I mean, do you mean you're talking about the BBC? The BBC, in my view, is one of the shining lights of journalism, and it is independently funded, and there is a key difference, I think, between a public broadcaster and a state broadcaster, and it's really important that we differentiate between those, because where we see state broadcasters engage in huge levels of propaganda, there is no editorial independence, and I believe, having watched many of my colleagues and the way in which they work at the BBC, that there is editorial independence, and I think it's important for us to be able to differentiate between the public broadcaster and the state-sponsored broadcaster. But I'm not sure that that's relevant to this particular discussion.
Well, it wasn't last week, was it? But I don't think anybody came here to hear about the woes and wrongs and rights of the BBC. Believe me, I got plenty of criticisms of my own employer, but we've actually hear about something that's really serious and important, and not about Emily Maitlis. We're talking about Jimmy Lai, who's facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in jail. And I do think you might respect that a little bit. Does anybody else have any questions? Sir.
Thank you very much. First of all, allow to present myself. My name is Iakavos Iakovidis. I'm the Deputy Chief of Mission of Greece here in Geneva. Allow me to congratulate you, the Club Suisse de la Presse, and the Committee to Protect Journalists for organizing this timely event. And I say timely because in the run-up of the Human Rights Council, we're going to have a resolution on the safety of journalists here. And besides Greece's interest in the topic, I'm personally also interested. I was part of the negotiation team in 2013 when we tabled the resolution in New York. So I believe that these awareness-raising events are very important for raising awareness on the situation of journalists. And despite all the texts that we have adopted through the years in Security Council, General Assembly, Human Rights Council, journalists continue to be threatened, persecuted, killed, and kidnapped around the world. So my question is a question that everybody asks, what we can do more. And do you think, and it's a question I'm asking all four of you, do you think that an international convention on the rights of journalists can be a plus on this struggle to ensure that journalists are safe around the world?
I'm going to ask Maria to answer that first.
If it's okay, I'll answer both questions, right? So I think that in the Nobel lecture, I called it a person-to-person defense of democracy. Yes, protecting journalists is important, because I don't know if you guys have ever seen an African safari. So I was in Tanzania, and I use this as an example, you know. Over 6 hours, we watched the wildebeest migration, and you know, there's so much of a crush from behind when you cross a ravine. The crush of the wildebeest pushes those in front into the ravine. And the ones that fall are eaten by the crocodiles, but slowly their bodies pile up and they're able to cross. The journalists are the ones that are getting pushed into the ravine, so please protect, help us. But in the end, you know, it is society that is paying this price. And oftentimes I've learned that when we only talk about journalists, the citizens of a democracy tune out. That's not the case. I think, you know, our lawyers can tell you more about what we can do in the UN system, but I think, and this is to address your question, I was at the Edinburgh Book Fair when Emily Maitland gave this. I think that every news organization, every journalist, every person in a democracy has got to look at the world again. The definitions have changed. It's kind of like Netflix, you know, the upside down in Stranger Things. It's strangely familiar, but the things that you used to do in the past, they don't work anymore, right? And the old power tends to hold on to the past a little too long, and again, we become the wildebeest that comes across. It's a long answer to your question, which is that we've seen this in every news organization around the world. And I think that's part of what sets Jimmy Lai aside, is that he's one owner who has decided he will stand for these principles. Lots of other things, you know, Apple Daily isn't always perfect. No news organization is perfect. But I think in the same way that we had to move away from climate change and the whole debate of false equivalence, we journalists have to find new words and infuse new meaning, because the social media platforms that are now delivering the news to us has atomized meaning and flattened these words. They don't mean the same things anymore. It's a little bit more complex than a punch-out, right? We are trying to do our jobs, but I think, please be aware, these times exploit. The social media platforms help exploit this. So, Keelan will know better on your question.
Could I just comment on your question? First of all, thank you for your leadership on safety of journalists' issues and for your work since 2013. I know many of us in the room are very aware of that and very grateful to you for that. I just had 2 points arising from your question on safety of journalists. The first flows from something that Jodie said earlier, where she referred to the build-up and how these things don't necessarily come as a bolt from the blue, but they're coming and they're coming and they're coming, and then what happens seems shocking. So I, along with Jonathan and Jen, act for the family of Daphne Caruana Galizia. When she was assassinated in Malta in a car bomb, so many people gave statements saying this is a bolt from the blue, it's deeply shocking. And of course it was deeply shocking. It was the assassination of a journalist in a European country, in a Council of Europe member state, a woman who'd been called a one-woman WikiLeaks, and the nation's conscience. But in many ways it wasn't shocking. And she gave an interview to the Council of Europe weeks before her death, in fact days before her death, describing in terms the risks she faced. And she described attacks coming from all sides, multiple libel suits against her, freezing of her finances, targeting of her family home, a dog being killed, firebombing of her house, threats online, threats on the street. And the phrase she used was, well, you get used to it in the same way that a scar forms around a wound, scar tissue forms around a wound. And I think Jimmy Lai's case is a very good example of that, as indeed is Maria Ressa's, where when you look at the headline point, what happened in August 2020 and the jailing, it looks horrifying. When you look at the shuttering of Apple Daily, it looks horrifying. That's why I mentioned the backdrop. And in many ways, that well-known example of the frog in boiling water should be very much in our minds. You know, so the idea is that if a frog is immediately plunged into boiling water, they realize it and they jump out. But actually, if you have a frog in tepid water and the water gradually reaches boiling point, they don't necessarily realize the danger. And all of the cases that I do about journalists' freedom and journalist safety, including assassination of journalists, key message for me is states must act sooner. And one of the concerns I have, many of the states that violate safety of journalists have commitments to freedom of expression. Their constitutions proclaim freedom of expression. They're signatories to the ICCPR, to international conventions. They claim to support the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings. But actually what we've seen, despite a range of conventions and focus on safety of journalists, is there's a stubborn statistic which doesn't just apply in dictatorships, it applies in democracies too, which is 9 out of every 10 killings of journalists occurs in circumstances of total impunity. And that's a statistic that hasn't changed. So I do support the idea of an international convention on safety of journalists. I also support, I'm a board member in the UK of Reporters Without Borders, and many of you will have seen Ray and Dmitry Muratov's 10-point plan on Friday, which also referred to the importance of a mandate holder. I support all of those things, but actually one of the key things we've got to tackle is there's a mismatch between what states and the international community say on paper and what they do in practice. And if we want to look at why these international conventions often don't have teeth, my view is states don't want to get bitten. And I really do think it's time that people took concrete, robust action. And that's why I gave the long list of asks today. We've got to do more. If we don't do more in a case like Maria Ressa's, in a case like Jimmy Lai's, what are we here for? What do the words on paper mean? We've got to do more. We've got to do something concrete. And the time for quiet grumblings in corridors is past. We need to do more.
So, last question.
There's one question asked by Laurent Sierot from the Swiss press agency Keystone, and the question is to Maria Ressa. He asked for what is the reaction to the decision taken a few days ago to withhold the license of Novaya Gazeta, the newspaper of your Nobel Prize winner Dmitry Muratov. What do you tell to Mr. Muratov, and how do you analyze this?
This is something Dmitry saw coming. When we were here in May, you know, the train had left. And so the fact that he went back, that he's still in Moscow, he is holding the line. I don't know if you saw last Friday, I will repost. I just posted the article. He actually, it was probably his most defiant speech so far, where he said he can't call this special operations war, but he can call it hell. And then the next day, I mean, yesterday, this decision happened. He knew it was coming. I think this is what it. Wow, actually the question is, why does it require this much from each of us as journalists, right? This shouldn't be the case. But I will also point you to what we launched last Friday at the Nobel Peace Center. It is a 10-point action plan that includes the creation of someone at the UN to take care of this. The biggest problem we face right now, and I'm going to quote a biologist, someone who studies emergent behavior in ants, it's the greatest crisis, he said, is our Paleolithic emotions, our medieval institutions, and our godlike technology. Dmitry is aware of all of these, and he is in Moscow holding the line. Good job.
Thank you. So if there is no other questions.
I'd like Jodie to just give a quick answer.
So clearly, again, this is something that we all saw coming, and it's deeply disturbing because this is a move that I think will enable the Russians to not just further restrict Novaya Gazeta, but other organizations as well. And this is what we've been reiterating throughout this conversation, is that these moves are not just targeted at the individual organization, they're intended as deterrents for others as well, and these have percussive effects. And I just wanted to say two very quick things in conclusion and in response to some of the things that we've discussed today. I think it's clear that the press freedom issues we're talking about are not happening in one or two countries. They're happening increasingly across the globe, and it's really important that the governments that we're talking to here understand that we need you to make sure that you are supporting press freedom in your own countries as well as internationally. And I understand how difficult it is for governments to speak out on these issues internationally if they're not doing so at home. The second thing is we need to be really aware of this increasing abuse of law. Governments are well aware now that it's much easier, rather than jailing journalists or making laws against journalism, you just find the journalists guilty of other things: tax evasion, foreign collusion, having foreign investors, and suddenly you can tie them up in lawfare, as we heard from Caoilfhionn, for many years without ever actually saying that you're tackling the freedom of expression. And we need to be much, much more alive to that, because that is growing. And finally, I just want to say to Jimmy, we are thinking of you. Everyone here is working extraordinarily hard, and I know how tough you are and how resilient, but I just want you to know that there is a great deal of support here in the room, but also globally for you and for your case.
I'm so glad you brought it back to Jimmy, because that's what this meeting is all about: democracy and free speech in Hong Kong, the case of Jimmy Lai and Apple Daily.
John, if you don't mind, do you mind if I ask a last question?
Okay.
Okay. To Ms. Gallagher, because it's an important question for Geneva here. The question is, do you really start a kind of new procedure today in front of the Human Rights Committee or any other international organization here in Geneva? And what kind of procedures are you starting, and what do you expect from it?
Of course. Well, the two urgent appeals which we filed are with the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. Their interactive dialogue is on the 19th of September. So that's an appeal which is currently before them. And we want that appeal to be taken forward as a matter of urgency. And we seek the support of all members of the Human Rights Council and all those engaging in the interactive dialogue in doing that. And we've also raised it with the UN Special Rapporteurs. So we're using those two mechanisms before the UN, and they're key steps which we're taking now. We are, of course, considering other ways in which we can hold the authorities to account on the international stage in the event that Mr. Lai is not released, the charges are not dropped. He's presently on remand, but we're waiting for the outcome in the fraud trial in October, the national security law in December, and reading the tea leaves, things are not looking good as matters stand, and that's why internationally support must be provided and steps must be taken to secure his release. And many of the answers to those problems lie in the audience that we have here today and the Human Rights Council that we have coming up, and then at UNGA, at the UN General Assembly with Leaders Week coming up later in the month. These are key opportunities for the international community to send a clear message to Hong Kong and to China that what is happening to Mr. Lai is unacceptable and he must be released forthwith.
Okay. I just also want to add my voice to the supporters of Jimmy Lai and to Jimmy himself. And we heard Caoilfhionn saying, tell the story, shout it from the rooftops. And we've heard Maria say, shine a light, hold the line. If you look away, you step back. Well, I don't think we want to step back from Jimmy Lai, and we are sending him a real message of support from this meeting, from the people who are here, and from people right around the world. So that's it. Thank you very much. We've got a reception now if you want to come and have a drink with us. Thank you very much for turning up.